Birch Street wasn't the kind of place people talked about, not because it was dangerous, but because it was so ordinary. A row of old homes with chipped fences and tired porches. Its only claim to fame was a massive oak tree that split the sidewalk in front of number 47. Most residents had lived there for decades. They mowed their lawns at the same time on Saturdays. They waved politely but not warmly, and they didn't ask questions, except about her. The woman who lived at the very end of Birch Street, the one with the ivy-covered house and rusted iron gate, was known simply as Miss Langford. To the children, she was the teacher who never smiled. To the adults, she was that woman who never left. No one remembered the last time they saw her at the grocery store. She never attended the annual block party. She didn't own a car. And yet, every morning, at precisely 7:15, the porch light flickered once, as if to say, "Yes, I'm still here." She had taught English literature at the local high school for over 30 years before retiring. No family ever visited, no friends came by. Some whispered she'd lost a child. Others believed she had once been married and divorced so quietly that no one noticed. Most people, frankly, didn't care. She wasn't rude, but she wasn't interested. And so, the town let her disappear, little by little, until the day a teenager's drone flew over her backyard, a glimpse into her world. It started as a joke. Tyler, a sophomore with more curiosity than sense, had been flying his drone down the street, filming the neighbors' dogs and laughing with his friends. When he reached the end of Birch Street, he hovered over Miss Langford's backyard, expecting to see weeds or maybe some garden gnomes. What he saw instead made him freeze. There was a pattern in the yard, not just rows of dirt, but something structured. Circular outlines, like the base of old machinery or foundations that didn't belong. And then the doors, 2 cellar doors, metal, padlocked. Why would a retired teacher need a locked cellar entrance in the backyard, one that no one had ever noticed? Tyler didn't say much at first, but the image burned in his mind. That night, he uploaded the footage to a private folder on his computer, and that's when he saw something else, something no one expected. A faint glow, a flickering light, coming from beneath the cellar doors. A life no one questioned. Miss Langford had been born in that house as far as records could tell. Property deeds dated back to 1939. She was listed as sole occupant. No siblings, no children, a single emergency contact, none. She rarely spoke to neighbors, except for brief hellos, but she did speak to the postman. James, the local carrier for over a decade, said she always thanked him for the mail. In perfect diction, with a slight British lilt, although she had lived in the States her whole life. He once delivered a package to her doorstep, unmarked brown paper, unusually heavy. She had opened the door just a crack, eyes scanning the street behind him before whispering, "Please, leave it and go." He never forgot the way she said, "please." It was polite but edged with fear. Whispers and theories. When Tyler eventually showed the footage to a classmate, it didn't take long to spread. A few days later, it reached Ava, a journalism major home from college for the summer. She had always been fascinated by stories people overlooked, and Miss Langford's reclusive nature immediately intrigued her. Ava knocked on her door on a Wednesday afternoon, claiming to be doing a project on retired educators. Miss Langford opened the door only halfway and listened carefully. She agreed to an interview, 1 hour only, no photos. Inside, the house was dim, curtains drawn, the air smelled faintly of lavender and parchment. Every wall was lined with bookshelves, yet there were no family photos, no paintings. Only one framed item, a certificate of commendation from a school in Vienna dated 1977. Odd. Miss Langford had never taught abroad. Had she? Beneath the floorboards. During the interview, Ava noticed something strange. Miss Langford's cane, a heavy carved piece of wood, tapped the floor in a specific rhythm every few minutes. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 1. At first, Ava thought it was nervousness, but when the older woman stepped away to make tea, Ava leaned forward and placed her hand on the wooden floor. It felt hollow. The conversation that followed was polite but stilted. Miss Langford was intelligent, articulate, and always redirected the conversation away from her personal life. She avoided questions about her youth, her family, or anything outside her years teaching grammar and poetry. But when Ava mentioned Vienna, she froze. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not something I talk about," she said, and ended the interview. A warning. 2 nights later, Ava found an envelope under her windshield wiper. No return address. Inside, a black and white photo. Miss Langford, younger, dressed in what looked like a nurse's uniform, standing beside a man in military attire. In the background, a barricade with foreign writing, and a sign partially visible. Checkpoint C. Ava looked it up. Berlin. Cold War era. What had Miss Langford been doing at a checkpoint in divided Germany? The past begins to echo. The next morning, the house at the end of Birch Street didn't flicker its porch light. Neighbors noticed. The mail sat untouched. The curtains remained drawn. Tyler flew his drone over again. The metal doors in the backyard? Gone, replaced with dirt, as if they had never been there. But Ava knew what she saw. She printed the photo, kept it in her notebook. Whatever Miss Langford was hiding, it had begun decades ago, far from their quiet little town. And the key to it all was under that house. She just had to figure out how to get in. Closing. Reflection. Some people live loudly, demanding the world to see them. Others live quietly, building walls so thick no one dares to look closer. But behind those walls are stories, lives lived in shadows, choices made in silence, and sometimes what you find under a quiet floorboard can rewrite everything you thought you knew about a person, especially someone like Miss Langford. For years, the creaking wooden floor of Miss Eliza Meyer's house had told its own quiet story, a tale of stillness, repetition, and solitude. Neighbors had walked past her little home at the edge of Oak Ridge with little more than a nod or polite wave. Some thought she was reclusive, others assumed she was simply tired after a long life teaching. No one, not even the kids she once taught, ever suspected that beneath the floorboards of her hallway, something was waiting. After her passing, the city assigned a property inspector to do a basic walkthrough of the house. Her only living relative, a distant cousin from Ohio, hadn't responded to calls. The house, modest and lined with bookshelves sagging under forgotten knowledge, stood quiet and untouched for weeks. That's when Ava Collins stepped in. Ava wasn't an inspector. She was an archivist, a young woman who volunteered with the Oak Ridge Historical Society, cataloging items from older estates before they were sold or demolished. She had a deep respect for the lives of the forgotten. Her work was part curiosity, part reverence. Eliza's home intrigued her. There was something timeless about it. The walls were covered with faded wallpaper, hand-painted in some sections. The windows, though dusty, still had lace curtains that caught the light like a memory. A narrow hallway stretched from the front door to the back of the house, lined with framed class photos from decades of teaching. It felt like walking through someone's legacy, quiet, proud, and secretive. But then Ava noticed something strange. Near the end of the hallway, where the floor dipped slightly underfoot, a board didn't creak like the others. In fact, it didn't move at all. Kneeling down, she tapped the plank with her knuckles. Hollow. The board was newer, the finish didn't match. Whoever had put it there had tried to blend it in, but not well enough for Ava's observant eyes. She retrieved a flashlight and small pry tool from her satchel. With some effort and care, the board lifted, revealing a metal ring embedded in a square of darker wood. A trapdoor. It was locked. Her heart raced. It wasn't unusual for older homes to have root cellars or storm shelters, but this had no record in the city plans. and the fact that someone had tried to hide it rather than simply leave it, that was something else. She checked again for a key. Nothing obvious. Then she remembered a detail from Eliza's bedroom. A necklace, not with a pendant, but with a small, old-fashioned key on the end. It had looked more sentimental than practical. Rushing back to the bedroom, Ava found it exactly where she'd seen it, on a hook beside the mirror. She slipped it into the trapdoor's keyhole. It fit. With a breath, she turned it. The lock clicked open with a dull metallic sound. She lifted the hatch. Below, a narrow wooden staircase disappeared into darkness. The air that came up was cool, still and dry. Not moldy like a typical basement. It smelled of dust, yes, but also something else. Aged leather, old paper, and wax? Ava hesitated, then descended. The staircase creaked under her weight, but held firm. A single light bulb dangled from the ceiling above, connected to an old pull chain. She tugged it. A soft, yellow glow filled the space, and what she saw left her frozen. This was no basement. This was a vault. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, all carefully labeled in Eliza's neat cursive. Decades of materials, notebooks, letters, newspaper clippings, passports, maps, old radios, even photography equipment from another era. There were filing cabinets with symbols Ava didn't recognize, and drawers labeled in multiple languages, French, German, Russian. There was even a mannequin in the corner, wearing what looked like a World War II resistance uniform. She blinked. Her mind couldn't process it all at once. On a desk near the center sat a large ledger, opened to a page filled with coded symbols and columns of names. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Some were crossed out, others highlighted. There were references to cities Ava knew from history books: Prague, Warsaw, Lisbon, Algiers. Her hands trembled as she reached for an envelope sitting on the desk. It was yellowed and sealed with wax, not with Eliza's name, but with an insignia she couldn't place. Inside was a photograph. It showed a young Eliza, or someone who looked just like her, in uniform, standing beside a group of men and women in civilian clothes. All their faces were blurred or scratched out, except hers, and in her hand, unmistakably, she held a weapon. Ava swallowed. Was this even the same person? Miss Meyer had taught poetry and literature. She had corrected essays with red pens and talked gently about Emily Dickinson. She once gave Ava an old paperback of Jane Eyre and said, "Sometimes the strongest women are the quietest ones." What was all this? A life beneath a life. Ava photographed the room carefully, resisting the urge to touch too much. She would need experts, historians, possibly even federal authorities, but more than that, she needed to understand what she'd found. As she climbed back up the stairs, she looked again at the hallway. All those class photos, all those children, and Eliza, smiling gently at the center of each one. But now Ava wondered who was watching who. Sometimes, the ones we overlook carry the heaviest pasts. Miss Eliza Meyer wasn't just a teacher. She was a keeper of secrets, of history, and of a courage that lived far beyond the chalkboard. The sun had barely broken through the heavy morning clouds when Ava returned to the house on Birch Street. The basement had stayed with her. The air, the silence, the presence of something waiting. She hadn't slept well. The notebook she found the night before was still on her desk, closed but pulsing in her mind like it wanted to be opened again. Ava opened it slowly. Its leather cover was smooth, aged. The pages inside were yellowed and thick, and every line of handwriting looked like it had been written with purpose. Each page contained names, dates, and short descriptions, most of them in cursive, neat and unwavering, but there was something odd about it. These weren't class rosters or journals. These were entries, records. The first name she read was Thomas H. Ellison, 03-11-72, returned after 2 months. Quiet. afraid of the color red. The second, Lucia B. Andrade, 1406-74, refused to speak first week, eventually drew maps, unknown origin. Dozens of names followed. Some had notes like taken in, escaped, or transferred. None had explanations. None made sense. These weren't students, at least not students from any normal school. Ava's hands began to tremble as she flipped further. Some names were underlined. Others were crossed out entirely. Then one page made her stop. Project Room Below, not to be disclosed until necessity arises. No contact with local authorities. Operating since 1969. Led by C. Hallberg. She recognized the name instantly. Caroline Hallberg. The same name on the school plaque, the one people said was the old literature teacher, the one who had disappeared for 2 years in the late 60s and returned with a noticeable limp and a silence that never left her. Ava's breath caught. It wasn't just a basement, it wasn't just dust and forgotten books. There was something else down there. She packed the ledger in her bag and walked to the small-town library. The librarian, George, had been there for over 30 years. He knew things, the kind of man who read obituaries like they were old love letters and remembered what people wore to funerals. "George," she asked gently, placing the book between them, "have you ever heard of something called Project Room Below?" His hands, always steady when handling books, paused. "Where did you find that name?" he asked, voice low. "In Ms. Hallberg's house, the basement." George closed his eyes for a moment. There are stories, not printed anywhere but whispered, about kids who weren't from here, not runaways, but found. They said Ms. Hallberg had a program, that she helped those no one else could help. Some say she worked with an organization, others think it was just her, taking in the broken, but then she stopped talking to anyone. Why? Ava pressed. No one knows. But around 75, she stopped teaching, said the world had changed, said they had made mistakes, and then she just faded into that house. Back home, Ava returned to the basement, this time in daylight. She turned on her phone's flashlight and started searching more deliberately. The corner with the cot had loose floorboards, beneath them a metal box. Inside, old ID cards, faded photographs, and one particularly worn envelope labeled, "If something happens." She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter. "To whoever finds this. My name is Caroline Hallberg. You may know me as a teacher or maybe not at all, but I was once part of something, a program not listed in books. We called it Room Below. It wasn't about hiding, it was about sheltering. Children who saw too much, escaped war, fled places we can't name. I taught them, fed them, helped them disappear, sometimes with new names. I don't regret what I did, but there are names I couldn't forget. They deserve to be remembered. That's why I kept the ledger. Be careful. Not everyone wanted this to be remembered. C.H. Ava sat back on the cold floor. This wasn't just a hidden past. It was a buried one. The kind of history no one was ever supposed to uncover. The ledger was a map, each name a breadcrumb, leading to a story silenced by time or fear. Over the next days, Ava began to research the names. It wasn't easy. Many had no digital footprint. Some matched missing children reports from decades ago. Others were traced to refugee databases, old international case files, and a few, incredibly, to academic journals. People who grew up to become scientists, artists, and professors scattered across the world. She reached out to one, Daniel Ruiz, listed in the ledger as arrived 03/03/71, Sever. The silence in Ms. Adeline Moore's house was never truly silent. It carried the faint groans of aged floorboards, the rhythmic ticking of an old pendulum clock, and now the slow breath of the unknown seeping through a door no one knew existed. Ava stood frozen, the ledger in her hand, the names handwritten with patience, reverence even. And now this, a square of outline under the rug, a hidden trapdoor near the back of the kitchen. The wood around it was darker, worn smooth, as if opened more times than anyone could guess. She knelt, hesitated, then pulled. The hinges didn't scream. They sighed like a breath released after years of holding tight. A narrow staircase descended into a dark space below the house. Cold air rose up to meet her, carrying dust, time, and something else. Something heavier, the scent of paper, metal, perhaps old ink. She reached for her phone's flashlight and began to descend. The room beneath was not what she expected. No cluttered storage, no forgotten furniture. This space was deliberate. The basement was dry, lined with old bricks and thick wooden beams. Along one wall, shelves stood tightly packed with labeled boxes, each marked by year and location. Bordeaux, 1974, Budapest, 1968, Santiago, 1980. On another wall, maps, dozens, some pinned, others rolled up in tubes. Each bore markings, circles, X's, arrows, in red pencil, just like in the ledger. At the center, a long table, aged but spotless. On it, a typewriter with a fresh ribbon, stacks of folders, a rotary phone with the receiver still intact, and in one corner a faded coat, hanging neatly. Next to it a badge, not from a school district, not anything Ava had seen before. It read, UNESCO. Education and Cultural Operations. Beneath the logo, smaller text in French. She whispered to herself, "This is something else." Ava didn't touch anything, not yet. She walked slowly, her flashlight scanning each corner. There were photos on the wall, black and white, some grainy, some impossibly sharp. Most were of children, classroom scenes, group photos, but some had faces circled. Not students, adults, soldiers, politicians, and Adeline. In nearly every photo she appeared, younger, dressed in modest clothes, sometimes in a crowd, sometimes standing slightly apart. The observer, the witness, the constant presence. It was a tea until she found the tape recorder, half buried beneath a stack of envelopes, that she allowed herself to sit. She clicked play almost instinctively. The voice that came through wasn't young, but it wasn't frail either. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, "then either you're nosy or you care." I'm hoping it's the second one. Either way, this story doesn't belong just to me. It never did. There was a pause, a long breath. I kept the room hidden, not because of shame, but because the world likes its heroes in uniforms, not in chalk-stained cardigans. Ava blinked. "My name is Adeline Moore, but for many, in many places, I was Anna, or Madame M, or simply the reader. I was never the one to lead, but I was always there when it mattered. When knowledge had to cross borders, when children had to be hidden, when a truth had to survive past a dictator's reign. There were clicks, perhaps her shifting a chair, then more. In Budapest, I smuggled books in hollowed-out loaves of bread. In Chile, I helped rewrite a school's entire curriculum in code so it could be taught underground. In Algeria, I taught girls under threat of arrest. Not because I was brave, but because I knew what ignorance did and what silence cost." Ava's throat tightened. This wasn't the rambling of an old woman imagining past glories. This was a record, a testimony, spoken like someone who knew she wouldn't be believed unless she left the evidence herself. The tape continued. "When I returned to the States, I asked for no honors. I didn't want medals. I wanted quiet. But I also wanted to remember, so I kept it all here, every file, every name, every school we rebuilt in shadows. I worked for UNESCO under diplomatic contracts, which meant I often wasn't there officially. My work never made headlines. That was by design. It had to be." A shuffle, a sigh. "They'll tell you I was just a retired teacher, that I lost family, that I withdrew, that I became quiet. Maybe that's true, but I never stopped remembering. the children who learned in whispers, the women who carried books sewn into their skirts, the guards who looked away, sometimes because they believed, sometimes because they feared. Ava sat in silence long after the tape ended. Outside, the late afternoon sun dimmed. The beams through the trapdoor grew softer, longer. She opened one of the folders. Inside, detailed notes on an underground classroom in Morocco, complete with supply routes, photographs of smiling students, and sketches of makeshift chalkboards. She opened another. Maps of East Berlin, notes in German, circles marking safe houses. A small pressed flower between two pages. This room wasn't a collection, it was a memorial, a personal museum. And Adeline, she wasn't hiding her past out of shame. She was protecting the stories of others, stories too fragile for the world to distort. Ava stood up and walked to the coat in the corner. She touched the sleeve, then looked to the badge. For a moment, she could almost imagine Adeline there. Younger, alert, sleeves rolled, ready to teach, ready to run, ready to do what no one expected of a schoolteacher. She took a deep breath, then climbed back up the stairs. That evening, Ava locked the house again, but she didn't call the police or the press, not yet. Instead, she made tea, sat at Adeline's old writing desk, and began to write. Not fiction, not a tribute, a record. For the first time in her life, she understood that stories weren't just told to entertain. They were kept alive because someone had dared to document them, because someone somewhere might one day find a locked door and care enough to open it. Chapter Reflection. Not all legacies come with headlines. Some are hidden behind trapdoors, filed away beneath decades of silence, but they speak, if we're willing to listen. Adeline wasn't just a teacher, she was a lifeline in places where hope had been outlawed. And now, through Ava, the stories whispered in the shadows had a chance to breathe. For days after discovering the underground room, Ava couldn't stop thinking about it. The faint smell of old books, the layers of dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades, the flickering light bulbs swaying above. Everything about that space seemed carved out of another life, and in a way it was, Adeline's other life. The journals had been written in multiple languages, French, Russian, and even Arabic. Some pages had been encoded with symbols Ava couldn't decipher. But one thing kept catching her eye. At the end of several documents, near signatures or dates, was a peculiar mark, a half circle with 3 dots beneath it, almost like a smile or a crescent facing downward. It wasn't a doodle, it was deliberate, consistent, and every time it appeared, the content of that page shifted in tone, more urgent, more encoded, more dangerous. Ava wasn't a linguist, but she had an instinct for connections. She took photos of the symbols and some of the more decipherable pages and sent them to a professor she remembered from her university days, Dr. Miles Renner, a polyglot who had once lectured on Cold War communication networks and underground intelligence scripts. It took him less than a day to respond. Ava, where did you get this? This mark, it's not a signature. It's a stamp used by a covert translator cell based in Berlin during the late 70s. We thought they were myth. That word hung in the air. Myth. A translator without a nation. Dr. Renner explained that during the Cold War, translators weren't just linguists, they were couriers, interpreters of meaning beyond words. Some worked independently, some under aliases, moving between embassies, universities, and war zones. Their job wasn't just to translate, but to decipher intention, to identify misinformation, political slants, and code hidden within speech and print. And one of the most elusive among them was known only as Eliane. No surname, just a trail of translations, edits, and reworked diplomatic messages traced across crises in Europe, the Middle East, and South America. Eliane was said to be a ghost, a master of accents and dialects, and fluent in silence. Renner wasn't certain. but he had a guess. I think Adeline wasn't just a translator. She was Eliane. The letters. They couldn't touch. Ava returned to Adeline's house the next morning. She brought gloves, a scanner, and a new notebook. She catalogued the books, photos, and writings carefully, piecing together timelines. Between stacks of dusty manila folders, she found a wooden box sealed with wax, the stamp again, the half circle and 3 dots. She hesitated. Then she broke the seal. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, most in languages Ava couldn't read. But she recognized the names. One envelope was addressed to a high-ranking official in the British Foreign Office. Another, in Cyrillic, was marked to be delivered only in case of death. Among them, a letter in English. Simple paper, no signature. Words are weapons, Ava, sharper than any blade. They can rescue, deceive, collapse, or rebuild entire nations. I used mine to shift truths just enough to save lives, and sometimes to end them. If you found this, I trust you'll know which ones should remain buried. Ava sat in silence. The air around her felt heavier now. This wasn't just a story of a lonely old woman. This was history, and it was loaded. A visit Ava didn't expect. That afternoon, a black sedan parked in front of Adeline's house. 2 people stepped out, a woman in a dark blue suit and a man with a clean-shaven head and a badge just visible at his belt. They knocked politely, firmly. Ava answered. The woman introduced herself as Agent Lydia Mora from the Department of Diplomatic Archives. They had received a notification that certain items of historical and international relevance had been accessed. It's standard procedure, she said, to verify that nothing classified has been compromised. Ava showed them the room. Agent Mora didn't look surprised. The man beside her didn't speak. They didn't take anything. They simply noted, photographed, and asked Ava to sign a confidentiality agreement until provenance and sensitivity can be confirmed. Before leaving, Mora paused at the doorway. You know, she said, we've been looking for Eliane for 40 years. Always assumed it was a man. Funny how people assume that, Ava replied. Mora smiled thinly. Not anymore. A name no longer erased. Over the next few days, Ava followed leads in silence. She didn't speak to the press, despite several inquiries. She ignored the messages from the Historical Society and requests from podcasters who caught wind of something big. Instead, she followed the trail of the mark, the translator's mark. One late night, she found herself staring at an image of a document released. The Freedom of Information Act. Redacted lines covered most of it, but at the bottom, in faded ink, was the same mark, and beside it, typed neatly, translation provided by Eliane, verified. Adeline had been there, in rooms where decisions were made, in conversations that shifted borders, in negotiations that saved or cost lives, and no one knew. No medals, no public record, not even a whisper in her obituary. Final words, etched in ink. Ava returned one last time to the basement room. She brought with her a single clean sheet of paper. On it she wrote, "She taught us language but lived in silence. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, nations heard her, even if they didn't know her name." She folded it carefully and placed it beneath the translator's mark. Some things, she thought, deserve to be remembered not with noise, but with quiet understanding. The box sat open on Ava's kitchen table, its contents still untouched since the night before. Pages in languages she couldn't read, tapes labeled with cryptic codes, and a small, brittle journal with the name Eliane embossed in fading gold. She hadn't slept much. The name haunted her, Eliane, not Adeline, or maybe both. By mid-morning, she was back in the basement, surrounded by dust and silence. But something had changed in Ava. The fear had faded. In its place, a quiet reverence took hold. She moved carefully now, as if walking through someone's memory. She took a deep breath and reached for a shelf she hadn't touched yet. Inside a battered leather binder were letters, typed mostly, some in French, others in English, and one stamped with a seal she recognized from documentaries, the logo of the United Nations. It was dated 1977. The letter read, "To EL. As agreed, the audio will remain sealed under Protocol 8L until reassessment by the committee. Your discretion continues to be critical. We acknowledge the sacrifice and the consequences that followed in Geneva." There was no signature, just initials. R.M. Ava sat down on the basement stairs, the paper trembling in her hands. Geneva. Protocol. Consequences. What had Adeline, or Eliane, been part of? She returned to the table and looked again at the tapes. One had a small mark in pen, "Whisper Room." It was almost too faint to see. She found an old cassette player in one of the storage boxes. After changing the batteries, she inserted the tape. The audio crackled, then silence. Then a voice, not Adeline's, low, male, cautious. "We're meeting under false lights." She translated every word, but none of us could tell what she was hiding, except maybe her eyes. They refused to echo what we said. And that's what saved us. Static. Then a woman's voice, clear, calm. "I'm not here to amplify lies. If truth is dangerous, I'd rather stay silent than become its shadow." Ava's breath caught in her throat. It was Adeline, younger, firmer, speaking not like a teacher but like someone who'd once stood in the middle of something far larger than herself. The tape ended there. That afternoon, Ava made a call to the university's language department. She explained she had old tapes in French and some letters she needed help interpreting. She didn't use Adeline's name. 2 days later, she sat across from Dr. Louis Ferret, a visiting professor from Marseille. He picked up one of the letters, his brow furrowed. "This is no ordinary correspondence," he said. "This format was used by operatives during the Cold War, especially those involved in mediation, translators particularly, those trusted by both sides." "You mean spies?" Ava asked. "Not exactly, but close. They were voices that weren't supposed to exist. They weren't just interpreting, they were editing reality." He pointed to a passage in the letter Ava had skimmed before. "Here, her refusal to translate a command prevented irreversible action in Cyprus. That's not translation, that's intervention." Ava leaned back, trying to digest it. Adeline hadn't just been a translator. She'd been a barrier. Someone who filtered truth, weighed it, and sometimes stopped it from crossing the line. "Why didn't she tell anyone?" Ava whispered. Louis folded the letter. "Because voices like hers were only powerful when they were invisible. Once seen, they lose all leverage. Silence was her currency." Ava returned to Adeline's house with the unease of knowing more than she wanted to, and still far less than what there was to know. She opened the journal again. It was in French, written in looping, elegant script. She could barely understand it, but one word kept appearing: choix, choice. Later that night, she sent a photo of one journal page to Dr. Ferret. An hour passed before he replied. His message: "This passage. It's her confession." She refused to deliver a translation that would have triggered military retaliation. She chose silence and carried the burden alone. She believed history would forget her. That was her final choice. Ava stared at the screen for a long time. The next morning, Ava walked the halls of Adeline's school again. She passed the rows of lockers, the scuffed tile floors, the faded posters about kindness and responsibility. How many times had students walked by her, blind to the storm that had once lived inside her? In the staff lounge, she saw a small framed photo on the bookshelf. It was old, black and white, the kind people stopped noticing. Adeline stood in the background, barely visible, behind a man in a suit. The caption read, "Geneva Peace Forum, 1978. She took it down and held it in her hands, a ghost in the margins. That's how Adeline had lived. That's how she had mattered. That evening, Ava sat by the basement door, holding the journal. She imagined what it must have been like, being the one who heard everything, translated everything, but spoke almost nothing of herself. She thought of the tapes, of the voices that were never meant to be played again, and of the silence that had shielded nations. Ava walks down the hallway of the school at dusk, the journal tucked under her arm. As she reaches the door to the basement, she hesitates, and then places the journal on the top step, like a quiet offering to the past. She doesn't go down this time. Some echoes, she realizes, aren't meant to be chased. It had been 2 days since Ava found the diplomatic badge and the sealed folder marked "Eyes Only." 2 days in queasy silence, the air thick with questions no one could answer. She hadn't told anyone, not the school, not the police, not even her closest friend. Something told her this wasn't a matter of local concern. It felt international. She stared at the folder again, still sealed, still heavy in its silence. But there was something else, too. At the very bottom of the metal drawer she'd found in Adeline's secret basement room. A false bottom she hadn't noticed at first. With trembling fingers, Ava peeled it away to reveal a stack of meticulously preserved papers. None of them bore official letterheads, no government stamps, no agency acronyms. They looked like simple reports, typed with an old Remington typewriter, the ink faint and uneven, the paper yellowing. But the stories they told, they were anything but simple. The first page read, "Operation Dust Rose, Lisbon 1974. Objective, secure verbal testimony from Colonel M.R. prior to revolution shift. Translator, Elian. Witness present, British envoy, R.A. Ava's breath caught. Elian, again." It wasn't a name you stumbled across lightly. In the files, the alias appeared again and again. Each report was a narrative, not cold intelligence, but living, breathing accounts. A child smuggled across the Berlin border, a general's confession recorded before he vanished, a secret meeting between rival factions in Cyprus held in a ruined monastery, and always, translator, Elian. Some pages were stained. One had faint fingerprints in a faded reddish hue. Blood. One page had no text at all, just coordinates. Another had a list of names, some crossed out in red, others underlined in green. Ava realized this wasn't just about Adeline being a translator. It was about someone who had witnessed the turning points of history from within the room, and had carried the words of the powerful and the desperate alike across borders into the ears of those who could change fates. Why would a school teacher, this quiet woman so reclusive, have these? Because she wasn't just a teacher, because Elian wasn't a pseudonym for espionage. It was a signature of survival. One report was especially long, 15 pages, front and back. It was written as a kind of memoir, no dates, no names, just a first-person voice. I stood at the edge of the compound as the jeep left. Inside it, the girl clutched a rag doll I had given her. She would remember the doll, maybe not me. That's the best kind of freedom, to be forgotten. Another passage. They let me in because I looked ordinary, a teacher, a translator, but words were my weapon, and I knew how to turn them into shields. Ava read until her eyes blurred. Then she read again, and when the sun came up the next morning, she was still reading. There was one final item, an envelope. On it, in neat handwriting, "To the one who finds this, you were meant to." Inside were 2 photographs. One, a younger Adeline, her hair tucked into a scarf, seated between 2 men. One man was instantly recognizable, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the 1980s. The other had his face blurred out, perhaps scratched away deliberately. The second photograph was more haunting, a group of women and children, eyes hollow, in a refugee tent. And there, at the edge of the frame, barely visible, Adeline again, holding a clipboard, speaking softly to a woman clutching an infant. Ava turned the photo over, scrawled on the back, "They never asked who I was, only if I could understand." Suddenly, every quiet habit of Adeline made sense. Her solitude, her meticulous routines, the reinforced locks, her avoidance of journalists, reunions, even friendly colleagues. She wasn't hiding from the world. She was protecting the world from knowing too much about her. Ava knew this wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about what to do with that past. She opened her laptop and typed the names from the documents into search engines. Most yielded nothing. Some names triggered firewall errors. A few led to obscure PDFs stored in governmental archives, but one result stopped her cold. A forum thread, buried in a forgotten corner of the internet. A user named Lanede had posted a cryptic message 10 years ago. "If you find the woman who never speaks of herself, listen anyway. She may be the last witness of a truth no nation dares admit." Ava stared at the username. Lanede, anagram of Elian. Had Adeline left that message, knowing someone might follow the trail? She printed everything, scanned documents, labeled files. She started creating a private archive, but even as she worked, her hands shook. Because now, this wasn't just about curiosity, it was responsibility. This was history in her hands, but not just history. This was unfinished business. Lives that had once depended on secrets were now tied to Ava's decision. Would she tell the world who Adeline really was? Or would she become the next keeper of silence? It didn't make the news, not yet. Not on any major site. It started as a quiet digital whisper, a curious thread on an obscure forum for retired diplomats, where someone under a pseudonym mentioned a schoolteacher with an unfiled past. Ava froze when she saw the post. She recognized the username RapaKek74. It had appeared in a few Cold War intelligence documents she'd found in Adeline's basement. A UN observer? An operative? No one could tell. But he knew something, and more importantly, he was willing to speak. She replied with a single question. "Did you know, Elian?" 2 days of silence. Then a reply. "She spoke 6 languages and knew when to stay silent in all of them. Never saw anyone do more with so little. If she retired, the world lost an invisible shield." Ava's stomach turned. It was real. And worse, Adeline, or Elian, wasn't just a witness. She was a link, a bridge between worlds that were never supposed to touch. Ava knew she couldn't go to the local press. She reached out instead to an old contact of her cousin, Marianne Colt, an international journalist known for exposing covert diplomacy and intelligence blunders during the Cold War. She sent a short email. "This isn't fiction. I found the documents. I found Elian. Her name was Adeline, and she lived alone at the end of Birch Street." The response came within 3 hours. "I'm flying out tomorrow. Don't speak to anyone until I arrive. MK." Marianne arrived with a tiny camera, an old tape recorder, and eyes trained to detect lies. Within 15 minutes inside Adeline's house, she stood by the hidden cabinet and said, "This woman wasn't just a translator. She was a mediator, an interceptor, maybe more. No one keeps these records by accident." For 3 days, they went through everything together. Marianne didn't take photos. She took notes, by hand, said it was safer that way. At the end of the 3rd day, she made a call to a contact in the European Parliament. "I need you to check if this name shows up in any joint operations. Elian, not as a code name, as a designation." There was a pause, then a response. "That name has been blocked." Blocked? Documents marked with that tag are restricted. Even officials with top-level clearance can't access them. Some files are labeled DSR, Diplomatic Silence Request. Marianne hung up slowly, her expression unreadable. Ava, you're sitting on a diplomatic earthquake someone worked very hard to bury. Days later, Marianne published a short piece on a small but trusted European journalism site. No real names. She referred to Adeline only as the silent witness. One line stood out. She was there, translating prisoner handovers. She was there, brokering evacuations. Her voice was a bridge that saved lives, but it was never heard. The story spread fast. Not viral, not loud, but quietly, among people who knew. A Greek reporter reached out, claiming to remember a woman who translated the last ceasefire in Kosovo. A retired Angolan officer described a translator who spoke peace like a native tongue. An Italian diplomat emailed a photo. 7 people seated at a negotiation table, UN flags behind them. At the center, Adeline, younger, focused, pen in hand, watching, not speaking. A silent presence that seemed to hold everything in place. The caption read, "Mission Archive, Tripoli, 1982. Intermediary, unidentified." Marianne leaned forward. It's her. They knew. They always knew. The next day, a Swedish television team showed up at Ava's door with a proposal. A documentary on the translator who never existed. Ava turned them down. This isn't a story, it's someone's truth. But there was one thing she did want, for Adeline's name to appear where it belonged, on a memorial. She submitted the documents to the European Memorial for Peacekeepers, a digital archive honoring those who had served in silent or uncredited missions. She uploaded the notes, photos, fragments of evidence. 2 weeks later, she received an email. Application denied, identity unconfirmed, documents unofficial, photo inconclusive, no recognized service record. Ava's hands shook. They'd rather pretend she never existed. But that same day, a second email arrived. This one from Henrik Marlue, a retired Norwegian intelligence officer. Her name is on our wall, coded, never erased, only hidden, to avoid diplomatic conflict. Maybe now is the time to bring her into the light. You're not alone. Attached was a screenshot of a digital memorial wall, hundreds of encrypted initials, one line highlighted in gray, ELN. Observer, confirmed. Status, peace agent, Class B. Ava wept. For the first time, Adeline's name, even if encrypted, was visible, official, acknowledged. She printed the screenshot and walked back into the quiet room that had once been Adeline's study. She placed the paper on the desk, where the old translation book still rested. Then she whispered, "They tried to bury you, but you planted something deeper than memory, and now the world is starting to remember." The invitation came folded in an unmarked envelope. No sender, no signature, just a small printed card. In recognition of uncredited contributions to diplomatic peacekeeping missions, Birch Street Community Hall, Saturday, 4 p.m. No press, no cameras, no mention of Adeline's name. Ava stared at it for minutes before deciding. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was something. A flicker of acknowledgement, buried under layers of protocol and silence. She went alone. The community hall looked exactly as it always had. Scuffed wooden floors, plastic chairs, a faint smell of old books and floor polish. A projector hummed in the back. The folding chairs were half empty. The audience, mostly seniors, city staff, and a few unrecognizable faces, dressed too formally for a neighborhood event. Then a man stepped up to the podium. Gray suit, unremarkable. We gather today in quiet respect for those who served not in uniform, but with words, silence, and presence. Their service remains undocumented, but not unfelt. He never said Adeline's name. He didn't need to. At the end of his speech, a small wooden plaque was revealed. It bore only a single inscription, "For the voice that translated peace." Ava scanned the room. And there he was. In the far back, nearly hidden by shadows, Emilio. Not the Emilio from the garden, not the one she'd met months ago. This Emilio sat perfectly still, like stone. But his eyes, sharp beneath his cap, were fixed on the plaque. Unblinking, Ava walked toward him slowly. "You came." He nodded once, barely. They couldn't say her name," she whispered. "They never will," he replied. "That was the deal. Her service existed between the pages, not on them." "But you knew her." Silence, then a sigh. "We all did. People like her. They didn't have families. They had missions." Ava sat beside him. They didn't speak for a long while. The ceremony continued. Someone read a poem. Someone else played a soft violin. The audience clapped politely. But Emilio didn't move. Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled a folded piece of paper and handed it to Ava. A photo. Young Adeline, no, Eliane, standing beside a train in Berlin, smiling. She wore civilian clothes, but something in her eyes betrayed the weight of responsibility. On the back, handwritten in faint blue ink, "If the world forgets, maybe this will help someone remember." Ava looked up, heart pounding, but Emilio was gone. That night she went back to Adeline's house. The lights had been turned off for months. Dust had settled across every surface, but Ava knew exactly where to go. She opened the drawer beneath the study desk. Taped under the lining, a false bottom. Inside, one small object. A brass nameplate, old and tarnished, engraved with delicate letters, Eliane Laurent, Observer Class B, Multilingual Division. It had no country, no flag, just her name and her function, and behind it, folded delicately, a certificate in French, dated 1983. Stamped with a seal Ava didn't recognize. Only one line stood out. For service rendered in silence. 3 weeks later, Ava returned to the community hall. It was empty, quiet. The plaque still hung by the exit, overlooked by almost everyone. Ava brought a small screwdriver. Carefully, she opened the frame and slid a second sheet behind the dedication. The photo Emilio gave her. She resealed it without a word. Now, behind that generic quote, hidden in plain sight, was the face of the woman whose silence had saved lives. And still, no one clapped, no one gave speeches, no parades. But sometimes, a teacher from the local school would pause at the plaque on their way out. A janitor might sweep the floor a little slower nearby. A child might ask who she was. And once, just once, Ava saw a man in uniform stop in front of it, place his hand gently on the wall, and whisper something in a language she didn't understand. Then leave. That was enough. Not justice, but memory. The house on Birch Street had gone silent again. Weeks had passed since Adeline's story came to light, at least as much of it as Ava could piece together. The news had already faded from the local channels. The international reports had been vague, skimming the surface of her legacy. But now, with the reporters gone and the city back to its quiet rhythm, the only sound in the house was Ava's own footsteps echoing softly against the wooden floors. She stood in the basement doorway once more, her hand resting on the frame as if to steady herself. The room below had been left almost untouched since the authorities completed their inspection. The files had been scanned and removed, the maps photographed and stored, and the books catalogued for translation. What remained were the walls, the air heavy with memory, and a few boxes too ordinary to draw official attention. Ava descended the stairs slowly, holding a flashlight even though daylight filtered faintly through the narrow windows near the ceiling. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she was sure Adeline had left something more, not in the documents or the data, but in the silences, in the empty spaces. A small wooden chest sat in the corner, tucked under a cloth and behind a broken filing cabinet. Ava hadn't noticed it before. She crouched down, brushed off the dust, and opened the latch. Inside were objects that didn't belong to any government archive. There were letters tied in bundles with twine so old it cracked in her hands. One envelope had no address, just a name, Eliane. The name Adeline had used in the field. The name no one in the neighborhood had ever heard. The letters were in French, German, Italian. Some handwritten, others typed. Many were stamped, received by agencies Eva didn't recognize. She opened one at random. The safe house in Trieste has been compromised. The American is safe, but the doctor was taken. Eliane knew. She warned us. We didn't listen. Another note, folded between 2 pages of a notebook, simply said, "You are not invisible. You are indispensable." Even if they never say it. Eva felt tears in her eyes before she even realized she'd started crying. This was it. This was what Adeline had protected. Not just facts, but people. Not just intelligence, but memory. The hidden human cost of war, secrecy and silence. These were not trophies. They were tributes. A photo slipped from between 2 envelopes. It showed a younger Adeline, mid-30s maybe, standing beside a woman Eva recognized from a grainy museum exhibit on resistance fighters. They weren't smiling. Their faces were tense, focused, standing in front of a wall covered in coordinates and timelines. Eva turned the photo over. Berlin, 1979, just before Madrid fell. It hit her then. The history stored in that basement wasn't just important. It was buried because it mattered, because it threatened the sanitized version of events told by those in power. That spring, Eva took a sabbatical from teaching. She didn't leave the house, not for a long time. She cleaned it top to bottom, as if tending to a sacred place. She sorted documents by language, made digital scans, and began learning to read the symbols Adeline had used in the margins of her books. She created a quiet room upstairs to write, and another downstairs to record voice notes. She started collecting testimony, first from old contacts Adeline had kept, then from strangers who emailed, recognizing a name or a mission mentioned in the story Eva had published online. The project had no funding. It didn't matter. People began sending her things, copies of letters, photos, even tape reels. She built a timeline. She rebuilt a life. And one day, a package arrived without return address. Inside, a small medal with no inscription and a note. "She saved my father. She never told us how, only that we owed her everything. H. Weiss." Eva pinned the medal on the wall, beside the photo from Berlin. Summer came. The garden behind Adeline's house had become Eva's new classroom. She grew vegetables and taught neighborhood kids about the world, about empathy, about secrecy, about truth. She never mentioned Adeline by name, but her presence lingered in everything Eva said. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the crickets began to sing, Eva opened the last box left untouched in the basement. It was heavier than the others. Inside were audio tapes, labeled in Adeline's handwriting. One label stood out: "My truth, to be shared only if I disappear." Eva placed the first tape into an old player she'd restored. There was static, then a deep breath, then the voice. "If you're listening to this, then I'm gone. Not by accident, not by choice, but because someone decided my silence was more valuable than my story." Adeline's voice trembled, not with fear, but with conviction. "I was never just a teacher. And if you think your life is small, let me tell you, the most powerful people I ever met were invisible. Not because they were weak, but because they chose it. Remember this, silence can be resistance, but so can telling the truth." That fall, Eva published the Birch Street Record, a digital archive of the materials she had organized. Quietly, without fanfare, it spread across academic circles, then into newsrooms, and eventually to the inboxes of people who knew too well what it meant to live in silence. A few months later, she received a single email. Subject: thank you for not letting her disappear. No name, no signature. But Ava smiled. She taught more than language. She taught courage. In silence, she protected lives. In death, she passed the torch. And now her truth walks with us, through gardens, through whispers, through the light that seeps under locked doors. Final narration. Sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest truths. Adeline was never just a teacher. She was a guardian of memory, a keeper of voices erased by history. And now, thanks to Ava, those voices are no longer silent. If this story moved you, share it. Because there are still stories hidden in basements, in notebooks, in the quiet corners of people who walk among us unnoticed. And maybe, just maybe, one of them is waiting for you to find it. Subscribe to Hidden Past for more real stories that were almost lost. And don't forget to turn on notifications, because the next story may be closer than you think.